Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Uli, and this is episode 145 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Mary Ruwart, a renowned libertarian figure, best-selling author, and expert in addressing complex political and social issues. Dr. Ruwart is a research scientist, ethicist, author, and libertarian activist. She holds a bachelor's degree in biochemistry and a PhD in biophysics from Michigan State University, and has held faculty appointments at St. Louis University's Department of Surgery and at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. She has designed and taught university-level courses in scientific communications and medical research ethics. For over 15 years, she has been the author of the very popular Ask Dr. Ruwart column in the Advocates for Self-Government online newsletter. A select compilation of these writings appears in her book, Short Answers to Tough Questions. This work compiles hundreds of challenging questions and Dr. Ruwart's concise, insightful responses. The book has become an invaluable resource to those seeking to understand and articulate libertarian perspectives on today's pressing issues. She's also the author of a complimentary award-winning book, Healing Our World. Dr. Ruwart's unique ability to provide clear, succinct answers to complex questions has made her a sought-after speaker and educator in libertarian circles. Her approach focuses on addressing contemporary challenges through the lens of freedom and liberty. Today, we will be discussing a chapter from her Short Answers book about how to address crime through the mechanism of restitution. So without further adu, welcome to the show, Dr. Ruwart.
Oh, well, thank you for having me, Alex. I really look forward to this particular discussion.
Yeah, so you and I exchanged a number of emails prior to coming on to record this podcast, and we're recording this Sunday, July 14th. But you and I have never met, and I actually learned about you through the Tom Woods Show. As I mentioned to you pre-recording, I've been a longtime listener of the Tom Woods Show, and I heard your recent episode and also one of your older episodes with him, I believe from 2015 was the first one I heard with you. And so I was just really impressed by, as I said in the intro there, your clear and succinct answers to really sort of difficult and complex issues. So I really appreciate you coming on to chat about part of your book. And I'm going to put up on the screen here just momentarily your book on Amazon for folks who want to go check it out. And I definitely would encourage, we're just going to discuss a very small part of it here today, one chapter about restitution, but you've got a great compilation of a wide range of topics in here, short answers to the tough questions. And so you can see it there on Amazon if you're watching this podcast by video. So with that being said, I gave kind of a long-winded introduction there. Is there anything I missed? And what are you up to these days?
Okay, well, I should mention that in Healing Our World, Chapter 13, I devote that whole chapter to this idea of restitution because I believe it's sort of the missing piece of the puzzle in a way. Some libertarians do talk about this, but it's such an important topic because it really balances what we normally talk about as the non-aggression principle, in that we don't initiate physical force, fraud, or theft against others. And so what happens if we do? Well, restitution is that answer. And I think it really changes the whole dynamics of, the system that we have in place, not just for policing, but for courts and for how we handle offenders. It really changes things in a way that we really have true rehabilitation, I believe. So it's very important.
Well, and frankly, I wasn't sure what to expect to be included in your book when I read it the first time, but I was so glad to see that you included restitution. Not only is it in your book, it's actually included very early in your book, which emphasizes, I think, how important this topic is. Because I think what a lot of, and I'll have you explain this more momentarily about what restitution is and what we mean by that. But ordinarily, when people think about crime and how crime is treated in most states today, and well, I think it's safe to say every state. I'm only licensed to practice in Indiana, but I think it's safe to say every state that there's either a punishment component or a rehabilitative component, especially when it comes to so-called drug crimes. Of course, I don't think possession of drugs or dealing drugs is truly a crime, and I think you would agree with me on that. But nevertheless, they're statutorily prescribed as crimes. So, and in fact, I had a judge on the podcast episode, along one of the early episodes, episode 27. He talked about retributive theory, which is just this idea that we should basically send a status signal to the offender, to the criminal offender, to punish them for the harm that they've done. The problem with that, of course, and I know you'll get into this, is that it doesn't or make the victim whole in any way. But it seemed to have some deterrent effect. The other component that's often considered in the criminal justice system is rehabilitation, which is focused on the offender and rehabilitating them so that they don't commit crime in the future. So it's forward looking. And then the third element or third possible way to treat crime is this mechanism of restitution. So with that background, would you mind to tell us what do you mean by restitution, and why do you focus on restitution as a way to treat crime?
Well, restitution is really the best rehabilitation. When we use restitution instead of jail time or other punishment, we find that the incidence of criminals going ahead and committing more crimes really goes down compared to, about some of the studies say as much as 85%, whereas in most studies of people who've been in prison, you see a lot of them, more than 50% of them, back in jail in about 5 years. So clearly the system we have in place now isn't working. And I think the reason it isn't working is it really isn't addressing restoring the victim. And really, if you think about it, the crime is not against the state or society as a whole. It's against an individual, or in some cases, several individuals. And the nice thing about restitution is that it truly lets the criminal know, or the lawbreaker, depending on how you want to think about this, the lawbreaker know what they've actually done. And Japan actually has a system of restitution. And that's very interesting, because what happens in Japan, once a person has been arrested but not yet convicted, or it's pretty certain that they're going to be convicted, a negotiation happens between the victim's family and the person who broke the law and hurt them. And they develop a plan for this restitution, in other words, an attempt to make the victim whole. And if that negotiation is successful, the victim goes to the judge and says, "Judge, I'm happy with this plan to restore the damage that's been done to me. So, take that into account when you fine or jail this person." And if the victim comes and makes a statement like that, the judge is very likely to give a very minor fine or very minor jail time to the person who is the aggressor. And what happens, most people who are going to commit crimes start with a smaller crime, not a huge crime. So if they get stopped at that point and they actually have to pay the cost of the damage that they do, it's a big lesson. And they go, "Oh, so crime isn't paying for me. This is bad. I'm not going to do this again." And consequently, a lot of them will not go on to be career criminals, which, of course, in the U.S., something like career criminals might commit 100 crimes a year or so before they're caught. And we can talk about why a system of restitution might improve those odds in the U.S. But getting back to the idea of this restitution, another factor is put into this. this negotiation that's going on between the family and the family of the offender and the victim really helps the person who broke the law and hurt the victim, really helps them understand what they really did in terms of emotional damage. In fact, what happens in the US oftentimes when a system of restitution is used, the big thing that the victim wants to get across is how hurt they were by this whole situation. And one of the reasons this system has been so successful is that people who offend, people who hurt others, especially at a young age, don't always really understand how much they've hurt the victim. In fact, there's been cases where the victim and the offender, by having a supervised negotiation, which is sort of the way it happens in the US, the offender really gets it. They know how much damage they've done, not just, in terms of theft, like they might have taken something and broken it or sold it or whatever, but also in terms of the emotional damage they have done to the victim. And that's a wake-up call for some of them. Not all of them, obviously, but for some of them. And that's helpful.
Yeah, one thing, and I see this in my practice, is that there's there's almost no focus on the victim, very little anyway, I should say.
That's right.
And it's all about how much time should this person spend in jail, how much time should they spend on probation, and then sort of an afterthought is how much should we repay the victim if they had property damage or something like that? But it has to be some tangible damage, not emotional, not anything like that,
Mm-hmm.
not psychological, and there's almost no focus on the victim,
That's right.
and the person, the lawbreaker, the criminal, is given a place to stay, a place to. Sometimes it's an improvement in their living situation to go to jail because they get a free meal, they get a place to sleep, and for a lot of them, they had very little assets going in. So that's one question I want to address is how would the criminal repay the victim?
And that's a great question. And what happens is when you have a system of restitution, and we have a minor one in the US, there are industries that spring up to help the perpetrator be able to earn enough that they can repay the victim. I think the one I wrote about in Healing Our World was PRIDE, Prison Rehabilitation, Industries and Diversified Enterprises, I think is what that acronym stands for. So what happens is the training component is also something that the offender has to pay back normally. It depends on the situation if we're talking here in real life, but ideally what would happen in a system of restitution is that the offender might have a choice about where he or she goes to get the best training and employment so that they can pay the restitution. And that cuts down on another big problem that we see with our prisons today, which is that our prisons are not generally safe. And there's a lot of offenses, I'll just say it, that are committed against prisoners and by other prisoners and sometimes by the guards, and none of that really gets taken care of properly. So the ideal would be that an offender would say, okay, I have this skill, but that's about it. So they would want to go to, if they were going to prison because they couldn't get employment outside the prison. I mean, if they could do that, they could just make payments to the victim. And of course, part of those payments would be for the court costs, because obviously the judges need to be paid. The jurors, to some extent, need to be compensated. And, other aspects of the apprehension system, like the police. So really, if the offender is going to pay all of those costs, it's highly likely, unless they're a very early offender, that they really are going to have a difficult time doing that. And so they're going to want to have the best situation employment-wise that they can so they can make those payments. And in some cases, for some of the offenders, it might need retraining. But the cost of that retraining would be worth it for them, because if they're doubling their hourly wage, they're going to be able to pay all this off sooner. So I think what would happen, and what has started happening, like with Pride, is they employ prisoners, and they do it in such a way that they also train them. In fact, the rate at which Pride employees end up back in prison is very low compared to the normal rates, because they exit Pride with a skill. And that's very exciting, because now, hopefully, especially if their crime was a property crime, they don't have to engage in that anymore in order to be comfortable on the outside. So this is, I think, a much better system than what we have now, where we throw them in a prison where they possibly could beat up or have to really beat up other people to stay safe. And of course, in the meantime, the victim's getting nothing, except they're having to pay for this prison stay, which is, I don't know what the current rates are, but I think it's in excess of $40,000 now a year to keep somebody in prison. Well, that's terrible. I mean, the victim not only has to not get restored in today's system, except for a few instances where we do have a practice of restitution, but they have to pay for the incarceration and, like you were saying, the lifestyle in prison, which, if it's an improvement for somebody, certainly isn't punishing them. In fact, I think a lot of the criminals feel that the incarceration is a way for them to learn from more experienced criminals, so when they get out, they can do a better job of being offenders.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen that. I think empirically, I've seen that in some of my clients who have been repeat offenders, that just become better criminals when they go to prison, oftentimes anyway. But you
Yes.
touched on a number of important points there. One of the most important points is the one you finished with there, is that the victim in the current system is not only suffering the harm of the crime, they're also suffering from paying for the punishment. So they have to basically suffer double punishment by suffering the crime and then paying taxes to fund the prisons, to fund the courts, to fund the police, and to fund the criminal going to one of these prisons. So it's really, in what world is that justice?
Exactly, exactly. And this idea of restitution, it's an old idea. Earlier societies, and when I say earlier, I mean prior to organized state societies, to some extent, what happened if somebody hurt somebody else? Restitution was the solution. That's how, and it wasn't until government got big that it started saying, oh, it's a crime against the state. In other words, if you are hurting another individual, the government sort of looks the other way, if you will. And the only way that there's even any apprehension or jail time for the offender is because the government is considering it a crime against society. But it's not really against society, it's against an individual or a group of individuals. And those are the people, of course, then, that should be compensated. They shouldn't be made to pay again after the crime's committed against them by being taxed to support this person in prison, where they're going to learn how to be a better criminal.
I'm glad you emphasized that point, because, and I'll link to this in the show notes as well. This is an article I found at the Mises Institute. It's actually a journal article from 1982 called "Retribution and Restitution: A Synthesis" by Peter Ferrara. Are you familiar with this particular journal article?
I'm familiar with Peter, but I'm not sure if
Okay.
I've read that article or not. I
Okay.
read a lot of stuff, and sometimes I don't remember who wrote it.
Well, I think he emphasizes the point you're making here, and I think this is really important. He says the right and power to impose sanctions is left solely in the hands of the victim. So there is no third party, i.e., the state, that has a right to impose any sort of cost or seek retribution or restitution from the criminal. You are the one who had your rights violated, and so to compensate for that, you are the one who has to assert those rights, not some other party. Is
That's
that
right.
Yeah?
That's right. And another thing, too, that's important about this is I've been asked, for example, on other discussions like this, what happens if somebody's so wealthy they can restore the victim? Do they get to not go to jail? Isn't that wrong? And the reality is that if a person's a repeat offender, certainly, especially in crimes like murder or rape, when the victim asks for restitution, part of that is likely to be that this person, this offender, gets locked up and doesn't get the choice to live in society. And when they get locked up, they have to pay for the room and board as well.
And I think that's another. Actually, we didn't. I didn't warn you about this, but I'll play it out anyway here.
Sure.
Obviously, this is the day after the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump.
Hmm.
This is the reverse of the scenario you were just talking about. The victim is apparently wealthy, and it wouldn't do much good to pay Donald Trump back for his ear. So how would that play out in this sort of system where of course the criminal wasn't killed by the Secret Service?
Well, again, it could play out differently depending how the victim reacts. So the victim, I mean, Donald Trump could say, hey, this person is clearly not just a danger to me, but to other people that he might not care for. So he really should be locked up, and that's the restitution I want. And of course, even if this person is locked up, instead of the taxpayer having to fund that, ideally, in a totally restorative restitution system, this person would end up having to pay room and board. Now, let's say that he can go to a prison where he's working and can do that. That's one thing. Or maybe he has resources and can do that. But maybe not. Maybe he's really impoverished. What happens then? Is that cruel and unusual punishment? Well, in all likelihood, my belief is that there would be charitable groups that would take pity on someone who might have extenuating circumstances, such as maybe not being mentally all there or something, and yet not what we would call insane or unable to, by legal standards, might not be considered to, should be relieved of any punishment or incarceration because of their mental state. I think a lot of people might feel like they should get a basic standard of living in a prison, and they would come forward and pay for that minimum standard. Of course, some people say, well, what if there's not enough charity? Well, here's the thing. Those of us on the outside of prisons, we have to work for a living, and we have to budget and things like this. So if a person, especially in this case, he could have killed the president or ex-president, and there's going to be probably some surgery involved. So it's not just the cost of that surgery for someone like Donald Trump, but he's going to be out of commission for a while at a very important time in his life when he wishes he were out campaigning. So there's a
He
lot
may
going on here.
he may pay for private security to supplement
Yes,
the
something
Secret
like that.
Service
Yep.
insecurity that he received. Right. Right.
Yes, something like that. I mean, it depends. Again, I think we have moved away from victim-based, I'm not going to say punishment, a restorative justice, I'll say. And really, a lot of victims, I think, would, especially for a repeat offender, would say, lock him up. That's what I want. I don't want to have to worry he's going to come back and attack me again.
And so, who ultimately, in your view, would make that decision? Just sticking with the Donald Trump
Mhm.
situation, if he says, "I don't want the money," he just needs to go to prison and pay for the prison stay.
Mhm.
Who gets to decide when the guy gets out? Is it Donald Trump, or is it some other? Is there some other mechanism to make that determination?
Well, I think it's always good to have a third party involved because obviously the victim and criminal both have skin in the game, so to speak. So it's always good to have, I think, a third party, but it wouldn't be, I don't think, like it is now. What would probably happen is both parties would try to find a mediator that they thought would be fair. And again, we have this happening a lot in California actually right now because the judicial system there was so overwhelmed. Some people who had been judges before and other people who felt qualified had started up this mediation business. And so that's kind of good because that can happen quickly as opposed to taking years. And that way, as long as both parties say, okay, I'll agree to do what this, what we decide in this system here, the mediation that we're going into, then I think it would work out pretty well because that third party could then make sure that the victim wasn't totally overreacting or that the criminal wasn't totally really not agreeing to anything. So, there'd be a little balance there
Yeah.
if people couldn't agree. Now, ideally the victim and the offender agree what's going to happen. But of course, in a case where someone like Donald Trump is saying, well, this person should go to jail because he's going to hurt somebody else if he doesn't, that, and how the conditions, etc., and of course the amount of money that would have to be paid for that imprisonment, a lot would depend on, again, probably a third party helping out in this negotiation.
Yeah, and it could be you mentioned mediation, which, of course, for folks who don't know, is a mechanism where people select a neutral party to help them negotiate some resolution that's mutually agreeable. The other alternative that I think is utilized more and more, especially as the inefficiency and the overcrowding of the courts continues to get worse, is arbitration, where each party picks basically a judge, not a state judge, but a private judge, to make a determination about the dispute. The judge hears the evidence from both sides and makes some determination, and it's a judge that they've both mutually agreed upon, not one that you just have to use because it happens to be in your jurisdiction.
Right.
So I think that's another possible private alternative.
Yes. I mean, the judges and the mediators kind of do a lot of the same thing. So, it would just depend on what the victim and offender can agree on.
Yeah.
I think failure to agree on something would probably be looked on as a very dishonorable thing. And with today's internet and everything, it would be very easy to point out someone who is not negotiating in good faith. And that person might have problems because I think there could be, by the average citizen, a feeling that they didn't want to deal with that person at all in any kind of business, or maybe not even selling them things, if they had a business. So I think a certain amount of ostracizing could happen, or boycotting could happen in a society where settling your disputes honestly and taking responsibility for things you've done in such a society, failure to negotiate and try to resolve issues would probably be frowned upon greatly and would have consequences.
So we've been talking about how to determine what the punishment should be or what the cost they should have to repay should be. Uh, would there still be a role for juries? I know we've alluded to that a little bit here, but as to the initial determination of guilt, do you still envision that there would be a jury trial process, or how would that work?
There could be. I mean, it would be really up to the way I see it is that the offender and the victim would have a lot to say about what process they chose. And I think many would choose a jury type trial. The issue with the jury, of course, in today's society, is that the judge really determines what the jury can hear. I think in a society where truth was very important, there may not be all the restrictions, the judicial restrictions that currently happen. There's, as you know, before a trial, the lawyers and the judge get together and decide what the jury can hear. Can they hear about past criminal activity by the offender, for example, or is that too prejudicial? So things might change in that arena if truth was considered to be the important factor. And again, I think the victim and offender would have some negotiation on which way they wanted to go on that.
You point out an issue that drives me crazy. I mean, we talk about how we sort of value the jury trial system and the right to a jury in a criminal proceeding, but then we also have this body of law, the rules of evidence, to keep them from hearing almost anything, and so it's really frustrating to me that our system has basically said, yeah, we really love the jury system and it's great and they have all this power, but we don't want them to actually hear anything or make any decisions about information that they might consider to be relevant, but we don't.
Yes, and also, of course, the judge's instructions to the jury. A lot of judges instruct the jury in a way that makes the jury feel that they can't judge the law as well as the innocence or guilt of the offender. And so, I think a system of restorative justice or restitution would probably change that.
Yeah.
I suspect that just the pressure from the fact that the offender and the victim are going to engage in some kind of negotiation would make that system change in a way that gave the jury the power it's supposed to have constitutionally.
And I should mention here, since we're talking about it, that you're also involved to some degree, and I don't know to what capacity. If you want to speak about that some, I'd be happy to have you tell our listeners about it. But you're involved with the Fully Informed Jury Association. What's your role there? What sort of connection or relationship do you have with that organization?
Well, I was on the board in the early years of its formation, I think probably for close to 10 years. I'm not on the board now, but I still, really feel wonderful about the work that it's done and is doing, because it's really changed. It's really changed things. I mean, the judges really not only, and they still do to a large extent, keep the juries from knowing things, but they also did not instruct the jury that they are supposed to judge the law as well as the guilt or innocence of the offender. And now, at least, there is, as my understanding, is that the schools that the aspiring lawyers go to do deal with that topic, whereas before they did not. So, of course, it's not universal, but I think big strides have been made in that, and the public has gotten some education on that as well.
Yeah.
In fact, unfortunately, sometimes if a prospective juror indicates that they know they're supposed to be judging the law as well as the guilt or innocence of the offender or potential offender, that they aren't allowed to sit on the jury. So again, this is why, again, a system of restitution where there's negotiation between the offender and the victim is going to probably fix that system, just because there's going to be a desire to choose somebody of that third party that is going to be more fluid in dealing with both parties, because it's really to the advantage of both parties.
So we've been talking about restitution and how it's distinct from other theories of justice, retributive justice, and rehabilitative justice, and why that restitution is superior in a significant way, because it focuses on the victim and restoring the position of the victim to the position they were in prior to suffering the harm of the crime. And of course, the victim can't always be completely restored, but at least they're getting something back. They're not having to suffer double punishment, as we were talking about earlier, not only the crime itself, but also paying for the prison sentence and the policing and the system, et cetera, through taxation. But one of the things that I think that is useful to discuss here, and I think our listeners will be curious about, is how would the prison system work here? I think we've been sort of touching on this to some degree, but it would be more of a private prison system, than the prison system that we currently have. Is that correct? And how would that work?
I think it would be. And the reason is that there would be a need for offenders to be trained, probably in great extent. Most of them would probably need to be trained to enable them to work off their restitution, because it's not just the victim. That's part of the restitution. The other part is law enforcement and the people who have captured the offender and brought the offender to a position where they're now negotiating with the victim to fix things. And if there is a trial or a mediation, obviously there would be issues with paying for that as well. And that cost might actually be, at least in the early stages of criminal activity, might be a bigger ticket than restoring the victim. I mean, if somebody got their house broken into and their TV and DVD player or something else was taken, that's one thing. But if you compare those kinds of costs to the apprehension costs, for example, it's probably much bigger. The nice thing about that is the offender is not only negotiating with the victim, they're going to have to negotiate with the people who apprehended them, the police, for example. Even if it's private police, there's a cost there. So I think it would, it's going to bring everybody together to decide just how much this offender has to pay. And it's going to be a lot more probably than just restoring the victim. At least that's, I think, how most cases would go. So the offender's got to be able to make enough money in order to pay these costs. Even if the person who was stolen from gets insurance money, it's still the insurance company which would get the restitution, so that the victim, because they're insured, would get their restitution right away. But for the apprehension apparatus and the other costs that are involved, courts or whatever, this is going to be a pretty big ticket item for most people. They will not be able to pay it right away. So the training comes in, and the private sector is just better at training workers and providing something. Like Pride, which I described earlier, they've got a great track record, and that's what I think would spring up. So, especially for theft, I think theft would be virtually wiped out, because if a person has to pay off a debt like that, they're not going to be stealing again. The harder ones would be people who are raping and murdering, because in a way, you can do a monetary compensation for a person who's raped, and they can use that money to get counseling and things like that. But still, it's not really a complete restoration. But go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to, you've mentioned it a couple of times, and I'm glad you brought it back up. Is it Pride, Pride, or Prime with an M?
Pride with a D.
With a D. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Because I want to make sure I link to that in the show notes.
Yes.
Because I'm glad you mentioned it, and also the example of Japan, because so often people think, oh, libertarians have these pie in the sky ideas, but it could never work in the real world, right? And these are examples of this sort of system working in the real world. So I want to make sure that I link to those resources.
Yes, and really I go through this with the Healing Our World chapter, and actually I'm happy to share it with your listeners if you'd like me to send you a copy.
Oh, that'd be fantastic.
Yes. And so be sure, I'll get it to you in the next few days, and if I don't, be sure to remind me. I have a lot of things. I'm going to actually make a note while we're online so I don't forget.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I'll send you a follow-up email.
I
Uh, but
appreciate it.
but but one question that I know lots of folks will have is, well, how this all sounds good, but how do you prevent the prisons from becoming basically from using criminals as slave labor?
Oh, I love that question. Yes, that's the thing. If the prisoners can choose their prison, then they will be able to choose the prison that not only helps them pay off their debt earlier, but they can also choose the ones that have the best reputation for not exploiting them or harming them. Because, if they're sent to a work prison, which few will be if they're willing to go out into the world and make regular payments that they've agreed on, very few people are probably going to end up in prison, because they'll be willing to do that. But maybe some of them are going to need that training and say, you know what, it's worth it for me to go to this prison, pay this extra money for the training, and get a reference when I get out, because otherwise I might not be employable. And so those people are going to, the reviews of prisons, just like there are reviews of everything else we consume. And if the prisoner can, I mean, they'd probably have to commit for a certain number of months or something, but, depending on how the system worked, it's all the free market. So, and
And,
if
and
they went somewhere and they didn't like it, they could change.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think this is I'm sure sounding very strange to many of our listeners because it's so different than the system that we currently have. What do you mean that the criminal gets to choose their prison,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, but remember, the focus here is on the victim, right, and
Mm-hmm.
restoring the victim to the previous position they held before the crime, not on the criminal. So the criminal would only be going to prison, right, if they could not pay the victim restitution while they were free, if they didn't have the
Mm-hmm.
income to do so while they were free.
Right. Or if they just refuse to do it, I mean, they might start missing payments or something. So that in that case, they're probably going to go to prisons where they can be, give them a little bit of what they earn for, their food and room and board, because they got to pay the prison too. See, it just doesn't, it's not going to make much sense for them to want to go to prison. But what they might choose to do is go to an institution or an organization that will train them and then put them to work, because that helps them pay off everything more quickly. So there'd be a lot of variety in this system. Again, the hard part would be those who commit a crime against a person like rape or murder. And again, my contention is that a lot of the victims are going to say, hey, this isn't the first time you've done this. I want to see you go to get locked up and not come back out.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Rather than have some sort of monetary,
mhm.
um, you know, payment, they'd rather see
Or
the person just locked up.
right, or they might want restitution, payment for the counseling or whatever they need to get over the trauma of whatever the event was, because they may be repeat offenders. Go to a place where they're locked up for whatever amount of time or for life or whatever. And again, that's why a third party involved is kind of a nice thing, because otherwise it could be difficult to reach that settlement. If both, because both both parties might have very extreme views of what they want, and that's where a third party might be helpful.
So you mentioned earlier that restitution actually has a significant deterrent effect, which is, of course, one of the theories that both of the other camps talk about, the retribution camp and the rehabilitation camp talk about, is that we want to deter future crime. So we either need to rehabilitate them or punish them so harshly that they're not likely to reoffend. And how does restitution operate to deter somebody from future crime?
Well, the way it works in Japan is they catch the offenders young. Now, here in the US, we might not even bother because it isn't cost effective in the current system. But in the Japanese system, it is cost effective, because the person who was apprehended is going to have to restore the victim And usually, so even if they're teens or minor criminals at that point, which is usually what happens with most criminals, they start small. So now it becomes worth it to bring them in, because once they have to restore the victim, they find out that crime doesn't pay. And if we had a system where on top of that was added the cost of apprehension, it would be, I think, even more of a deterrent. So there really isn't very much repetitive criminal activity in Japan compared to the US. Like I said, in the US, in about 5 years, a huge percentage of, and that number changes, so I can't give you an exact number, but I've seen numbers as high as 85% of the people end up
Well,
back in prison.
this is a separate statistic, but I'm going to put this up on the screen. It sort of captures the same problem. Uh, And I think that most people are unaware of how significant of a problem it is in the United States. This is a website from the Prison Policy Initiative, and this is their states of incarceration for 2024, and it shows the incarceration rate in every U.S. state as if every U.S. state were a country. And you see El Salvador is at the very top, but then you notice on the left side that a lot of these U.S. states, Louisiana is up there very high. Indiana is actually very high, 721. If you compare Indiana's incarceration rate, for instance, where I'm from, to, you have to hit show all to keep going here, to Russia, a dictatorial country, most of us would think is far more tyrannical than the land of the free, the United States, has an incarceration rate of less than half of Indiana. And I think that holds true in many states in the United States. Of course, you see there Vermont is lower than Russia and a few other states, but the incarceration rate in the United States is off the charts, and a lot of that is being paid for by the people who were themselves victimized. And this gets back to the points we were making earlier in the show. So I think clearly what we've been doing, as you say, is not working. Uh,
Right.
and,
Well, and part of the incarceration rate here in the US are what we call victimless crimes, drug offenses. Somebody is caught taking drugs. They may not have harmed anybody, but that doesn't matter. that's that's still a crime that you can be punished very harshly for, with long imprisonment rates.
one question that you and this is somewhat related, but you mention in the book, the Short Answers book, the question is, would you agree that the absence of a system of government, police, courts, prisons, and military would be a state of anarchy and would bring intolerable chaos? And I thought your answer to this question was really interesting, and I think people might find it interesting and compelling. Would you mind to say a little bit about that question?
Sure. Well, when I went into classrooms for about 10 years, and talked about the libertarian ethic and talked about private policing. And one of the questions I got was, well, what if the private police started stealing from us instead of protecting us? And I would say, well, you just don't subscribe to them anymore, and then they don't have any money coming in so that they can go after people. And, you know, I've lived to see the public police go ahead and confiscate all kinds of things without accusing the person they're taking it from of a crime and preventing them from recovering it by a kind of using legal tricks, I'll say. Because what happens is a person who's impoverished or not, maybe they have a car and some cash, but that's it. Then they get those things taken away from them. They're in a position where now they can't go to work. They don't have their savings, and they can't or don't think of hiring a lawyer to try to get them out of that mess, because we license lawyers, they're very expensive. And we can't have somebody else stand up for us that knows the law but might not be so expensive. So those people never get their money back. And the Libertarian Institute for Justice has really come down on this. Policing for Profit is the name of the studies that they've done, and they've done two versions of it, 1 and 2. And really, I think most people in this country are not aware that the police confiscate an awful lot of stuff, and they can do it as they, stop people for the broken tail light or whatever. And if the person has any kind of reasonably large amount of cash on them, they assume that it's drug related. They take it from them. They take the vehicle in which it is found. And these people have very little recourse. And the Institute for Justice has been trying to change the laws and has effectively done it in several states, and is, as time goes on, is really becoming more effective at getting rid of some of this confiscation that's taken without a trial.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know if that's the part you were thinking about,
Yeah,
but
well, there's actually multiple parts, and that's that's. I'm glad you brought that up. That's not the part I had in mind, but this concept or this scheme that you're referring to, of course, is civil asset forfeiture,
Mhm.
and it's a terrible, awful. It's as bad. It's worse than even that you've said. Actually, I'll just give a quick story, and I can't say too much because the case is still pending. But there was a person who shipped a large sum of cash to a family member. It was transported by air, and it was at a shipping terminal. And the local police, had a team, the city actually, a dedicated team to searching or scanning all the packages that came through this particular terminal. And they used a drug dog to do this. And a drug dog provided an alert to this particular package that it was just a box with cash, presumably positive alert for the scent of drugs. And of course, as we all know, cash is exposed to drugs all the time. The cash that somebody has in their wallet has likely been exposed to drugs at some point. But they open the box, and all that's in it is cash, no drugs. And based on the dog sniff alone, they confiscated the cash and would not return it to the person,
Mhm.
to either the person who shipped it or to the intended recipient. And the person had to file a case, had to hire an attorney, file a case to attempt to get it back. They would not try. They would not agree to give all or even part of it back in an effort to avoid litigation, because guess what? The local police department is not the one that is paying for the litigation. So why would they give any of it back? And that's what this policing for profit is. If there's any connection to a supposed crime, they can confiscate that asset, civil asset forfeiture, without a charge, without any criminal prosecution.
Mhm.
And so that, I don't think most people know how widespread that is. And they use those funds, of course, to pay for to pad the local police department budgets, to do more of the same sort of activity. So it's really bad practice. But the part, and if you want to say more about that in a moment, I'm happy to get more of your thoughts on that, because I think it's a really important issue and really a great topic for an entire separate podcast. But you mentioned, and I think this is a really important, really interesting part. Police and courts are few in number. They can't control a populace in a high crime area where many people have no respect for property rights. They can only curb aggressors in a predominantly peaceful population. The government protection racket usually creates more chaos through violation of property and personal rights than the so-called criminal element. And of course, that touches on the civil asset forfeiture portion. But I thought that was interesting because there are lots of no-go zones for law enforcement in various large cities where they just don't go. In the areas of Atlanta or Los Angeles, they just leave alone because they can't control, they can't curb the crime there. But they're happy to sit outside of a gated community where there's very little crime, and catch the passerby drug user every once in a while because they look bad on the sidewalk for the people who live in the gated community. And I think that your point here gets to that. And so that, and then you go on and give this example of the Wild West example. Would you mind to say a little bit about that?
Oh, yes. So you mean the when the Wild West was settled? That
Yes.
yes, by yes, Terry Anderson wrote a really great. I guess you'd call it a. I guess it was a magazine article for Libertarian Journal of Libertarian Studies. Yes. Okay. So he wrote about the so-called Wild West. In fact, it was called the Not So Wild West. And what he did is pointed out that the settling of the Western United States happened when they weren't states. So basically, they were anarchies. And what ended up happening is instead of it going crazy, as it's often portrayed by Hollywood, it was actually very orderly. And if you doubt that, think about which areas of the country are most likely to leave their doors unlocked even today. And it's, the Western states, the ranches and things like that. And they have this history because what the history is that the settlers actually made a little constitution for their group if they were on a wagon train or whatever. And when they settled, when the wagon train got to where they were settling or whatever their transportation was, I guess sometimes it was by rail, they homesteaded the land and they agreed by this constitution how they would act, and what they would do for people who violated the contract, basically. And of course, different parts of the Western states had different contracts because they were settled by different groups. Yet, when there was disputes between the two different groups, they went to mediation, or they had judges that were appointed by the groups get together. They basically did what we talked about, and their theme was restitution. And even in places like where they were dealing with pollution of the rivers from upstream, they had agreements that they would negotiate a settlement, just like we've been talking about this whole hour. And it was amazing because these agreements that were made between two different groups often were used by other groups as a way to settle their differences. And so it wasn't so wild as we're often portrayed by Hollywood. And actually, it's a really great article. If you type in Terry Anderson, Terry Anderson, and the Not So Wild West, you'll come out with several places where they have basically for free. You can get this article. It's quite a long article. I think about 30 pages long, but it's small print, but really detailed, and it really gives you an idea of how liberty truly works, because it was totally free. There was no government courts, there was no government police, there was nothing. They had to make it up as they went along, and it was an incredibly good job.
I just searched for it while you were talking about it there. It looks like it's available on the Mises Institute website, so I'll
Mhm.
link to that in the show notes as well. I hadn't
Yeah.
read that myself, so I'd be interested to read it
Yes.
myself.
And
Yeah.
and if you would, I think your listeners would probably like to know about the Institute for Justice, ij.org, and you can search all the different things that they get into. But if you put in their search engine "policing for profit," you will find the first and second, I think there's two of them, white papers that they have on this civil forfeiture that we were talking about. Very informative. So I'd really like to shout out for those two.
Yeah, I'll certainly link to their website as well. I did an episode, one of the early episodes about civil asset forfeiture and mentioned them, but I don't think I've mentioned them since then. So they're definitely worth another mention, and I'll link to that policing for profit page in that white paper as well. So thank you for suggesting that or recommending that. We're closing in on an hour here. Actually, we're right at an hour, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. Uh, Is there anything else? I know we've touched on a number of the issues that you address in your book, but not nearly all of them. Is there anything else you think that is essential for our listeners to know before we close up here?
Well, if they are interested in some of my writings and things of that nature, they can go to my website, ruwart.com, RUWART.com. And my books, Healing Our World and Short Answers to the Tough Questions, which you talked about, you can get them there. You also see Death by Regulation, how we were robbed of a golden age of health and how we can reclaim it. In that book, I talk about my experience being a pharmaceutical research scientist at the time when it was an ethical industry. And it has turned into something else. And the reason is because of the FDA regulations. And not too many people could have written this book, which is why I spent 5 years doing it. And I certainly, if that's an interest for your readers, they can go there. And of course, the books are also on Amazon. And you can contact me by going to the About Dr. Ruwart tab and sending me a message if you wish. And that's a good way to contact me because I get so much spam at mary@ruwart.com that it's possible that I'll miss your email. But I get a special flag on these emails that come through from my website. So I'm much more likely not to miss your email. And of course, if you're writing me and wanting more information, I certainly do want to hear from you.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Ruwart, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to our listeners.
Well, I've enjoyed it, Alex, because, these are actually very important things we're talking about. And as your listeners can surely understand from the things we've talked about today, the system is really pretty broken, and we need to know that there is another way. And you've given me the opportunity to share my opinion on that. And you shared some of yours, and I think the listeners are going to be very happy to have another perspective.
Yep, certainly, certainly. Well, thanks again for joining the show. I really enjoyed the conversation myself. If nobody else did, then fine. This show is. I hope that our listeners get something out of it. But at the very least, I talk to people that I think have things that are interesting to say, and you certainly do. So, thanks again. And I'll certainly link to your website, ruwart.com, and to your Facebook and X page. I think you're active on Instagram as well. I'll be sure to link to
Yes.
that as
Yes.
well. So, because you post a lot of great content, you post things from memes and quotes to lots of more in-depth articles and publications as well. So, I'll be sure to link to all of that as well.
And if you send me a link to this podcast, I'll post that as well.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much. All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. As always, you can find the show on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, X, and at forgeoffreedom.com. Until next time, everybody, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.